When World War II began in September 1939, most people imagined a familiar kind of conflict. Armies crossing borders, tanks advancing across open fields, cities bombed into submission. But another war began almost immediately. Quietly, coldly, without speeches or dramatic announcements. The day after war was declared, the Allies announced a naval blockade against Germany. On paper, it sounded like a standard move: cut the enemy's supply lines and weaken their ability to fight. What few understood at the time was that this decision triggered the longest, widest, and most unforgiving campaign of the entire war. One that would stretch across millions of square miles of ocean and last nearly 6 years. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun. Britain entered this war with a weakness that could not be solved by courage or speeches. It was an island, and islands survive only as long as ships keep arriving. Britain could not produce enough food, fuel, or raw materials to sustain its population and fight a global war at the same time. Every single week, more than 1 million tons of supplies had to cross the Atlantic just to keep the nation alive. If that lifeline were cut, there would be no heroic last stand and no dramatic invasion. Britain would simply collapse, slowly at first, then suddenly, through hunger, power shortages, and industrial failure. This is the harsh reality behind the Battle of the Atlantic. It was not a war for glory. It was a war of numbers, a war of tonnage. Whoever sank more ships would decide whether Britain lived or died. Germany understood this from the very beginning. German naval leaders knew they could not reliably defeat the combined Allied fleets in traditional surface battles. So they turned to a weapon that did not follow the old rules of naval warfare. A weapon that struck without warning below the surface, far from view. Submarines, U-boats, narrow steel cylinders designed for stealth, not comfort. Inside them, crews lived for weeks surrounded by metal, oil fumes, stale air, and constant tension. There was no room to stand upright, no privacy, and no escape. Every patrol meant accepting the possibility of never returning. But despite the fear, these submarines represented Germany's best chance to strangle Britain without ever landing a single soldier on its shores. At the center of this strategy stood Karl Dönitz, a veteran submariner from the First World War. Dönitz understood the mechanics of underwater warfare, but more importantly, he understood fear. His strategy was brutally simple. Do not waste time chasing warships. Attack the merchants. Sink cargo ships. Sink tankers. Sink anything carrying food, fuel, or raw materials. Dönitz believed that if Britain's supply lines could be severed, the country would be forced out of the war without the need for invasion. But from the start, his plan faced a critical problem: time. When the war began in 1939, Dönitz commanded only 57 operational U-boats. To make his strategy truly effective, he needed closer to 300. He had hoped for years of peace to build that force. Peace never came. Even so, the attacks began, and for a frightening stretch of the war, they worked. Between 1940 and 1942, U-boats seemed to dominate the Atlantic. Using wolfpack tactics, one submarine would locate a convoy and transmit its position by radio. Other boats would converge silently. Attacks often came at night when visibility was low and Allied escorts struggled to respond. Torpedoes slammed into the hulls of merchant ships at close range. In minutes, vessels were burning, sinking, or breaking apart. Crews were thrown into the freezing Atlantic, where survival was measured in minutes. Rescue, when it came, usually came too late. This was not a romantic naval struggle. It was industrial destruction carried out in darkness. As the months passed, the ocean filled with wreckage. Convoys vanished. Losses mounted at an alarming rate. Allied escorts were stretched thin. Aircraft lacked the range to protect ships in the middle of the ocean, and vast areas became deadly gaps where submarines could strike almost at will. Rationing tightened across Britain. Every ship lost meant less food, less fuel, fewer weapons, and fewer choices. In London, fear was not abstract. It was calculated. How many weeks of supplies remained? How many ships could be lost before the system collapsed? How long could a nation survive when its lifeline was being severed again and again? Years later, Winston Churchill would write that the only thing that truly terrified him during the war was the U-boat threat. Not the bombers over London, not the threat of invasion. The Battle of the Atlantic frightened him most because it had no clear front line. It happened everywhere and nowhere at once. It was fought in silence, day after day, far from public view. And for a long time, it looked as if Germany might actually win it. But war never stays frozen in one shape. While U-boats continued to sink ships, something began to shift beneath the surface of the conflict. The Allies realized they could not win through bravery alone, or even by building more ships. They needed to change how the ocean itself worked as a battlefield. They needed to detect what could not be seen. To hear what once sounded like silence. Slowly, almost invisibly, the Atlantic became a more dangerous place for German submarines. New technologies emerged. New tactics were refined. New methods allowed escorts and aircraft to locate, track, and attack U-boats that had once disappeared without a trace. The ocean, which had protected the submarines, began to betray them. German crews felt the change before they fully understood it. Submarines began to vanish. Attacks that once ended in quick success turned into long, exhausting pursuits. Depth charges exploded closer and closer. Aircraft appeared where none had before. Escort ships moved with growing confidence as if they knew where the submarines were hiding. Fear began to shift. The hunter started to feel watched. The predator began to sense it was becoming prey. The breaking point came in 1943. By the spring of that year, the numbers told a grim story, and in May they became undeniable. U-boats were being destroyed faster than Germany could replace them. Entire crews disappeared. Patrols failed to return. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, had become a graveyard for submariners. Karl Dönitz was forced to accept what could no longer be denied. The cost had become unbearable. He withdrew his boats. Germany's tonnage war had failed. The plan that might have broken Britain without invasion had collapsed under the weight of Allied adaptation. Victory came at an enormous cost. Thousands of Allied merchant ships were sunk. Warships were destroyed. Nearly 800 German U-boats were lost, taking their crews with them into the cold darkness of the deep. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a single dramatic moment or decisive clash. It ended the way many real wars do, when one side could no longer afford the losses. The ocean took its toll from everyone. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was never just about ships. It was about survival under constant pressure, about how long a nation could endure when its lifeline was under relentless attack. It was about men sealed inside steel hulls, knowing that a single mistake, a single sound, or a single unseen enemy could mean the difference between returning home or vanishing forever beneath the waves. For years, the ocean decided who fought, who starved, and who survived. Victory came not from a single heroic moment, but from persistence, adaptation, and the slow realization that fear itself could be turned against those who once controlled it. The Atlantic kept no scoreboards and offered no glory. It only recorded outcomes. And when the war finally ended, it was clear that this invisible battle shaped everything that followed. Without control of the Atlantic, there could be no buildup of troops, no invasion of Europe, no liberation of the West. The world that emerged after 1945 was built on this quiet, relentless struggle, fought far from land, where technology met terror and endurance decided history. Even today, the ocean keeps its secrets. Wrecks lie scattered across the seabed, ships broken in half, cargo frozen in time, submarines resting like steel tombs. The Battle of the Atlantic was the largest, longest, and most complex naval battle in history, not because it was glamorous, but because it was unforgiving. For years, The greatest fear of the war did not come from the sky or the land. It came from the depths, silent, patient, unseen, until the balance finally shifted. If you stayed with this story until the end, it means this wasn't just background noise. It means this invisible war held your attention. And that's exactly why this channel exists. History isn't shaped only by famous battles and speeches. It's shaped by moments like this, when fear, technology, and human limits collide far from the spotlight. Leave a like. It tells the algorithm this story mattered. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because in the next episode, we go even deeper into the moments when the enemy realized the war had changed and there was no way back. This is the enemy's fear, WWE. And these are the stories history almost let sink.